History remembers kings, conquerors, and nations. But sometimes the most powerful empires are built by families no one ever talks about. Families that do not raise armies, yet bend entire civilizations. Families that do not write laws, yet shape the fate of those who do. In the 19th century, one of these families stepped out of the shadows and discovered something extraordinary. They found a way to turn addiction into a financial system. Not an accident. Not a side effect. A system. Their name was Sassoon. They began as refugees fleeing Baghdad with almost nothing. But they arrived in Bombay at the exact moment the British Empire was facing a crisis that could collapse its economy. China had the goods Britain needed, but Britain had nothing China wanted. Silver poured out of London in rivers, draining the empire's strength. To survive, Britain needed a product that China could not resist. And they found it in opium. But opium alone could not save an empire. It needed someone to move it, scale it, industrialize it. Someone who understood trade risk and the quiet spaces where law and profit no longer overlap. The Sassoons stepped into that space. They built networks. They financed farmers. They controlled warehouses, ships, and credit. They became the engine that kept silver flowing back to Britain. Millions of Chinese lives were destroyed. 2 wars were fought. A civilization was humiliated. Yet when the dust settled, the men who helped make it happen were not condemned. They were honored, knighted, celebrated as philanthropists. Their names were carved onto libraries, hospitals, and docks. This is not just a story about the past. It is a blueprint for how power survives. How suffering becomes revenue. How revenue becomes influence. And how influence becomes legacy. And if the pattern looks familiar, it is because the world is still using it today. When David Sassoon arrived in Bombay in the early 1832s, he did not look like a man poised to shape the fate of empires. He stepped off the ship as a refugee, not a prince of commerce. A displaced trader fleeing political danger in Baghdad, not a figure anyone expected to change global trade. Yet Bombay offered something Baghdad no longer could: a place where power, money, and opportunity collided every single day. The city was chaotic, loud, and crowded, but it was also positioned at one of the most valuable crossroads in the British Empire. Goods from the Middle East, India, and China moved through the harbor in an endless stream. Cotton from the Deccan Plateau, gems from inland kingdoms, and silver from every corner of Eurasia passed through its warehouses. And above it all stood the British East India Company, an institution that governed millions of people, with the logic of a corporation and the authority of a sovereign state. Sassoon immediately recognized what others struggled to see. The company was powerful, but it relied on intermediaries who understood the world beyond official channels. It needed translators, networks, and trusted financial agents. It needed merchants who could move credit through informal systems and navigate cultural boundaries that company officers could not cross. This was where David had an advantage. He came to Bombay with deep connections across the Middle East, a network of Jewish, Arab, and Persian traders who trusted his family name. At a time when contracts were fragile and communication slow, this network acted like a private financial circulatory system. Money, information, and obligations could move through it faster than through any official institution. He also understood how political systems behaved when they were stressed. As the son of a former treasurer in Baghdad, he had watched rulers lean on merchants when they needed liquidity or discretion. In Bombay, he recognized the same pattern in the East India Company. The British wanted profit, not cultural entanglement. They ruled through taxes, armies, and trade monopolies, but their reach had limits. They needed people who could operate in the gaps between 2 worlds, the formal world of empire and the informal world of merchants. Sassoon began modestly small loans, basic commodities, and cautious partnerships. But beneath this slow start was a sharp instinct. He was studying the financial arteries of the empire, watching how silver flowed, how ships moved, and where shortages emerged. And one shortage kept appearing in every conversation: Britain's dangerous dependence on Chinese goods and the massive outflow of silver needed to pay for them. This imbalance was not just trade friction. It was an existential financial problem for the empire. And if Britain was under pressure, then whoever could help relieve that pressure would become indispensable. Slowly, Sassoon positioned himself for that moment. He built relationships with company officers without becoming their subordinate. He expanded his trading network without exposing himself to unnecessary risk. He learned how credit moved through Bombay's bazaars and how decisions traveled through the company's bureaucracy. By the end of the decade, he was no longer just a newcomer trying to rebuild his life. He had become a quiet but critical node in Bombay's financial ecosystem, A merchant who could move goods, money, and trust across borders, the company could not navigate alone. What he did not yet know was that the British were about to choose a solution to their China problem, one that required the exact combination of skills he possessed. When that decision came, it would transform David Sassoon from an ambitious trader into an architect of one of the most profitable and destructive economic systems in the modern world. By the time David Sassoon had learned the rhythm of Bombay, the British Empire was confronting a crisis that could not be solved with diplomacy or military force. It started with tea, something so ordinary in British life that few understood how deeply it tied Britain to China. Tea had become a national habit. Silk, porcelain, and luxury goods followed the same path. But China wanted almost nothing Britain produced. It rejected British textiles, British machinery, British metals. The emperor demanded payment only in silver. That single rule created a financial wound that grew wider with each passing year. Silver flowed out of Britain and into China in volumes that alarmed London bankers. The number echoed across the empire, nearly 8 million pounds of silver lost annually. For a nation operating under a strict metallic monetary standard, that was not just inconvenient, it was dangerous. An empire cannot sustain global reach if its reserves are being drained faster than they can be replaced. The British East India Company needed a product China would buy in massive quantities, and they needed something they could control from end to end. They found that product in opium. India's climate suited poppy cultivation, and the company already controlled the land taxation and labor. What emerged was a state-directed system that treated opium not as a crop, but as a financial instrument. It was, in many ways, the empire's hidden monetary policy. But the factory lines of Bengal and the poppy fields of Bihar were only half the equation. The company did not have the flexibility or the deniability to handle the distribution into China itself. This final critical step required networks operating beyond formal structures, capable of navigating smugglers, corrupt officials, unpredictable seas, and local markets. It required someone comfortable standing at the edge of legality, risk, and empire. This was where David Sassoon moved from observer to strategist. He understood immediately that the value of the trade did not lie in touching the product. It lay in controlling every component around it. Farmers needed advance financing before planting. Factory agents needed credit to prepare shipments. Maritime transport required insurance. Chinese merchants needed discreet arrangements and protection from sudden crackdowns. At each point in the chain, someone had to assume risk. Sassoon realized that if he could take on all that risk and price it correctly, he would control the system. He began with credit. He lent to farmers under terms that pushed them into poppy cultivation season after season. Once a community accepted these loans, food crops disappeared, replaced by poppy fields. This created a dependable supply. Next came storage. Sassoon built secure warehouses near major ports, allowing him to buy at auctions and time shipments with precision. Then he expanded into shipping, reducing his dependence on outside carriers and ensuring the discretion the company needed. By the mid-1830s, his operations resembled something far more sophisticated than a merchant house. They functioned like a private financial infrastructure supporting a trade that the British state relied on but could not publicly acknowledge. Sassoon loans financed production. Sassoon warehouses protected inventory. Sassoon ships carried the cargo. Sassoon agents handled distribution in Canton and Macau. Profit accumulated at every layer. The numbers reveal the transformation clearly. In the early 1830s, roughly 30,000 chests of opium, each weighing about 120 pounds, reached China annually. Within 2 decades, that number doubled and then nearly doubled again. Every chest entering China sent silver back toward London. Every shipment kept the British monetary system intact. For China, this flow of opium was devastating. For the British Empire, it was salvation. And for David Sassoon, it was the opportunity of a lifetime. He had taken the empire's dependence on a narcotic economy and turned it into a private engine of wealth, one built not through violence or conquest, but through financial engineering. What he could not foresee was how violently China would react. The strain was becoming unbearable, and one man would soon rise to confront the empire that depended on addiction to keep itself afloat. By the late 1830s, the financial logic of the opium trade was working perfectly for Britain, but the human cost inside China was reaching a breaking point. Addiction spread through coastal cities and river towns with frightening speed. Men who once supported families lost their wages in smoke-filled dens. Households collapsed. silver reserves drained from the imperial treasury. Officials at every level reported the same pattern, a society slowly losing its ability to function. The Qing court needed a response that was both moral and forceful. They found it in Commissioner Lin Zexu, a statesman known for discipline and integrity. When Lin arrived in Canton, he moved with a clarity that stunned foreign merchants. He blocked access to warehouses, cut off supplies, and demanded the surrender of all opium stocks. After weeks of standoff, he seized more than 1,400 tons of opium and ordered it destroyed. The mixture of resin, lime, and salt seeped into the sea, forming dark currents that carried the ruined drug away. Lin also wrote a letter addressed to Queen Victoria. In it, he asked a simple question: why would Britain, a nation that banned recreational opium at home, allow its merchants to poison millions abroad? The letter was both diplomatic and damning. It exposed the moral contradiction at the heart of British policy. But no moral argument could outweigh the financial importance of the opium trade. Britain responded not with introspection, but with force. In 1840, British warships appeared along the Chinese coast. Fast steam-powered vessels, advanced artillery, and disciplined naval crews easily overwhelmed outdated Qing defenses. The war was swift and deeply unequal. By 1842, China had no option but to sign the Treaty of Nanking. It required massive reparations, 21 million silver dollars, and forced the empire to open several major ports to British trade. It also ceded Hong Kong. None of these terms slowed the opium trade. If anything, they expanded the pathways that fed addiction. The victory proved profitable for David Sassoon. With new treaty ports open, his network pushed deeper into China's commercial arteries. His agents built relationships with local brokers, positioned warehouses near high-demand regions, and secured shipping routes that had previously been off-limits. But China had not given up. In the 1,850 seconds, Qing authorities made another attempt to enforce prohibitions in the treaty ports. Once again, Britain intervened, joined this time by France. The Second Opium War unleashed destruction on a scale China had never experienced. Foreign troops marched into Beijing. The old Summer Palace, a masterpiece of Chinese art and architecture, was looted and burned, a symbolic wound inflicted on an already weakened empire. With the Treaty of Tientsin in 1860, opium effectively became legal. Legalization transformed the nature of the trade. What had once required shadow networks and covert transactions now flowed openly. And with legality came normalization. In India, the opium factories continued to operate. In China, demand surged. In London, silver returned steadily to the treasury. And in Bombay, the Sassoon family stepped into a new role. They used their profits to build institutions. Cotton mills, trading houses, docks, libraries, schools, and hospitals, all funded by opium revenue, began reshaping the city's skyline. Public generosity softened public memory. David Sassoon became a respected figure in Bombay, a man who contributed to civic life and sponsored community development. His son, Albert Sassoon, received a knighthood from the British Crown, cementing the family's position within imperial society. This transformation was not accidental. It was strategic. By investing in public works, the Sassoons created a layer of respectability that distanced their identity from the source of their wealth. Western newspapers praised their charity. Indian elites attended openings of Sassoon-funded institutions. The connection between their fortune and the suffering in China grew fainter with each passing year. Yet beneath this respectable exterior, the core truth remained unchanged. Their rise had been made possible by a system that treated addiction as a financial necessity. Even as their buildings stood tall in Bombay, the damage in China deepened. The wars had ended. The treaties had been signed. But the consequences of the opium era were still unfolding across a society struggling to regain its footing. The Sassoons had secured their legacy. What they could not know was how fragile their empire truly was, and how the same blueprint they embodied would reappear again in another century under another name. For nearly a century, the Sassoon Empire operated with remarkable momentum. Their mills powered Bombay's early industrial growth. Their docks expanded trade capacity. Their properties in Shanghai generated enormous returns, as the city became the financial gateway to East Asia. From the outside, the family looked untouchable. They had money, influence, and a reputation polished by philanthropy. But beneath that image, their power was built on foundations that could shift suddenly. And in 1949 they did. When the Chinese Communist Party took control of Shanghai, one of its first priorities was to reclaim the city from foreign influence. Foreign-owned businesses, banks, mills, shipping companies, warehouses represented a past China was determined to erase. Among the largest targets were the properties held by the Sassoons. Entire blocks of commercial real estate built and accumulated over generations were nationalized. Ownership was transferred overnight. The papers bearing the Sassoon name lost their value. Victor Sassoon, the family's final major commercial figure, had no choice but to flee. A dynasty that once controlled the most profitable narcotics network in modern history saw its Asian fortune evaporate within days. Their British operations did not fare better. With the collapse of their Chinese assets, the family's influence shrank. Successors struggled to adapt to the new economic order of the mid-20th century. Poor management and strategic mistakes eroded what remained of the empire. By the late 20th century, regulators in the United Kingdom declared the leadership of one successor company unfit to serve as directors. It was a quiet bureaucratic ending far removed from the dramatic rise that had once reshaped Asia. Yet while the empire fell, the wealth did not disappear. Much of it had already been converted into property trusts and philanthropic foundations long before their commercial collapse. Buildings that bore their name continued to operate. Endowments established with opium profits survived political upheavals. The dynasty dissolved, but the legacy remained woven into the streets of Bombay and the institutional memory of cities across Asia. And the system that made their rise possible, the economics of dependency, did not collapse with them. It simply evolved. In the late 20th century, a new family in a different part of the world discovered its own version of the opium blueprint. The Sacklers. Through Purdue Pharma, they marketed OxyContin as a safe, long-term pain treatment, despite knowing its addictive potential. Their strategy borrowed the same principles that had governed the opium trade a century earlier. Identify a product that creates dependence, scale distribution through trusted intermediaries, and present the business as a benevolent service. The outcomes were similarly catastrophic. Hundreds of thousands of Americans became addicted. Entire communities collapsed under the weight of opioid misuse. Lawsuits spread across states. Under public pressure, Purdue filed for bankruptcy, and the Sacklers agreed to multi-billion-dollar settlements. But even as they lost their company, they shielded much of their fortune. Most of their wealth accumulated through the very dependency they claimed to treat remained intact. The parallel is not a coincidence. It illuminates a structure that repeats across generations. Empires built on addiction rarely survive politically, but the incentives that create them survive economically. Addiction provides recurring revenue. Recurring revenue builds institutions. Institutions preserve wealth. And wealth once secured becomes difficult to challenge, even when the moral origins are exposed. This is why the opium blueprint did not vanish with the Sassoons. It migrated into new industries, pharmaceuticals, consumer products, technology. Anywhere dependence can be engineered and monetized. The substance changes, the geography changes, the families change. But the model remains the same: create demand that never ends, convert it into predictable income, and protect the legacy through philanthropy and public influence. The fall of the Sassoons was dramatic, but it was not the end of the story. It was proof of something far more unsettling. Empires built on dependency may collapse, but the economic logic behind them never truly dies. It simply waits for its next form. When we look back at the rise and fall of the Sassoons, the temptation is to treat their story as a closed chapter. A scandal of another century, a tragedy tied to a distant empire. But history does not close chapters neatly. It preserves what is convenient and erases what is uncomfortable. And in the case of the Sassoons, the world remembers the buildings they left behind while forgetting the millions of lives shaped by the trade that financed them. Walk through Mumbai today, and you can still find the David Sassoon Library, the Sassoon Docks, and institutions funded by their philanthropy. These structures have weathered monsoons, wars, and political transitions. They stand as symbols of progress, literacy, and commercial expansion. But they also stand as reminders, quiet and unspoken, of a fortune built on dependence and pain in another land. The connection is rarely mentioned. Generations grew up walking past these buildings without knowing that a global narcotics empire helped pay for them. China, meanwhile, inherited a different legacy. The opium era fractured its economy, drained its silver reserves, and weakened its government to the point that foreign influence became unavoidable. The humiliation of the Opium Wars did not end with the treaties. It lingered through political instability, internal rebellions, and decades of foreign concessions. The trauma formed the backdrop of what China later called its century of humiliation, a narrative still deeply woven into national identity today. Opium was not just a substance, it was the mechanism through which China lost control of its economic destiny. Yet even as nations processed this history differently, one truth remained consistent. The wealth extracted through addiction did not fade with time. It converted into endowments, real estate, charitable institutions, and social status. What disappeared was the memory of how that wealth was made. This is not accidental. It is how power protects itself. Philanthropy reshapes public perception. Buildings outlast the controversies that funded them. Over time, the story becomes sanitized and the moral weight dissolves. The Sassoons are not unique in this pattern. Their story simply reveals the machinery behind it. In the modern age, pharmaceutical giants built similar fortunes through opioid-based treatments, psychiatric drugs, and chronic medication models. The Sackler family used philanthropy to embed their name into museums and universities, just as the Sassoons did with public buildings in Bombay. And even after public outrage forced institutions to remove the Sackler name, the wealth they accumulated remains largely untouched. Dependency economics, whether legal or illegal, continues to be one of the most profitable systems in the world. This raises an uncomfortable question. If the 19th century was defined by opium and the 21st by opioids, then what form of engineered dependence defines our present moment? It may not be a substance at all. It could be digital platforms designed to exploit attention. Subscription models that lock consumers into endless payments. Financial products structured so that users can never truly exit. Or medications marketed not to cure but to maintain, creating a permanent customer instead of a healthy one. The pattern is always the same. Dependence becomes revenue. Revenue becomes influence. Influence becomes legacy. And legacy becomes a shield that protects the system from full accountability. Understanding the Sassoons is not about revisiting a forgotten corner of empire. It is about recognizing the structure that allowed them to rise and seeing how that structure persists today. Their story warns us that the most powerful systems are not always built through conquest. Sometimes they are built through need, through habit, through dependence that feels normal until it no longer is. And if we ignore that pattern, we risk repeating it. Not with opium, not with opioids, but with whatever new form of dependence the world is quietly learning to accept.